Hey guys, we are going to come into the Struggle for Equal Rights chapter right now, and then next week you will have an exam on all of the material we've covered so far this semester. It'll be about 25 questions, multiple choice, same as your quiz. So let me know if you have any questions, and it'll get posted on Monday, and you'll have all week to take it just like you did your quiz. All right, the Struggle for Equal Rights. In 2016, when a racial majority becomes a minority, this was a 2016 election cycle kind of confusing time, and honestly we're still in it a little bit. Trump showing the America First ideology that works electorally, yet it was overtly racist and alt-right ideology that opposed immigration and multiculturalism, the classic democratic values that undergird the American political system. Trump's remarks have encouraged bigotry, saying one problem this country has is being politically correct, igniting and giving hope to a dark side of American politics, as we've seen in recent days. Trump's campaign has made deliberate appeals to voters' sense of racial and gender grievances, and many have felt liberated by this campaign. Folks with out of the mainstream views, white supremacy perhaps, have felt that maybe their ideas are taken out of darkness. There were vocal supporters of Trump, but they were a small group at that time. A lot of Trump supporters are rural males without college educations who maybe don't think of themselves as racist, but they recognize the white privilege they've been born into, only with the absence that they're facing with their dwindling share of the American dream, as they're told their birthright and those who believe in their facts are targets of racist behavior. Trump used language and keyed to invoke nostalgia for American long gone, make America great again, using again and back. People speaking to people who think America maybe isn't as great as it once was. Racism, honestly, has been a permanent thread in the American political fabric and might always be. But there are some undeniable facts. Our racial landscape is changing. Whites are a diminishing racial group, and people of color are growing in numbers. There are nearly 11 million undocumented workers that live and work with the United States, and there's no way to repatriate them. A black man was elected to serve 2 terms in the White House and left with a significant majority approving of the job he had done. But the newly elected Republican government promised to dismantle it. What's at stake when a demographic group that's accustomed to being privileged starts to lose its majority status? What's at stake in civil rights in general? When you consider where we started, progress in the United States can look pretty impressive. We have more racial equality. Just over 60 years ago, it was illegal for most blacks and white to attend the same school in the South or to use the same swimming pools or water fountains, but this is a distant memory. Exactly 40 years after Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Oh, what you doing, baby?" said he dreamed of a day where a child would be judged by his character, not the color of his skin, Barack Obama accepted the Democratic Party's nomination for presidency, which he won twice. But there still are only a few blacks in national elected office. Civil rights. This is citizenship rights guaranteed to the people primarily in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments. What are you doing? And protected by the government. Formally granting a civil right doesn't necessarily bring about speedy changes in social and economic status. This also includes Native Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans. These have all faced unequal treatment in the legal system, in the job market, and in schools. Women, half the population, have long struggled to gain economic parity with men. Sexual orientation, age, physical disability, citizenship status, these are also groups that have been denied rights. Intersectionality is the interdependent discrimination and oppression that results when an individual is a member of more than one oppressed minority group. For example, you are black, female, and poor. The United States is haunted by traditions of unequal treatment and intolerance that it can't entirely shake. As we pay attention to some of those rights that are haunted by these traditions, it's seen by some white people as maybe diminishing their own rights. Americans expect that the law should treat people equally, but laws by nature must treat some people differently. Laws don't discriminate between those who abide by society's rules and those who don't, but they can treat 2 criminals differently once they're convicted. In all but 2 states, felons are denied the right to vote for some length of time, and in some states permanently. So when the law can treat people differently, there are 3 classifications for determining what's discrimination and what needs a legal remedy. There are 3 tiers. The first is classification that's so rarely constitutional, they are called suspect. Suspect classifications require the government to have a compelling state interest for treating people differently. Race is a suspect classification, a classification which any discriminatory law must be justified by a compelling state interest. Courts are subject to this heightened standard of review called strict scrutiny, and they have to assess the constitutionality of laws that limit some freedoms or make a suspect classification. Courts look carefully at the laws and the government interests involved. The laws that deprive people of fundamental religious rights were once required to pass this test, and at that time, religion was viewed as a suspect class. The second tier is less potentially dangerous to fundamental rights, fall into this middle tier, quasi-suspect. They're subject to an intermediate standard of review, which is a standard of review that courts use that make a quasi-suspect classification. The Supreme Court looks to see if a law requires a different treatment of people, if the different treatment of people bears a substantial relationship to an important state test. The important state interest test is not as hard to meet as a compelling state interest test. So, for example, a law that treats a woman differently than a man falls into this category. And then the least scrutinized category is for non-suspect. This is subject to the minimum rationality test. The Supreme Court asks whether the government has a rational basis for making a law that treats a given class of people differently. These are laws that discriminate based on age. For example, a curfew for young people, economic level, higher tax rates for those in certain income tax brackets. This need not stem from a compelling or important state government interest. The government just needs to have a rational basis for making the law. This is fairly easy to show. The Supreme Court is unlikely to permit any laws that treat people differently, so gaining the status of a suspect class is crucial in the struggle for equal rights. So why do we deny rights? Usually it's explained by creating a narrative focused on the characteristic of a group. A group is maybe not civilized or does not recognize the true God. People are compelled to justify poor treatment by blaming the group that they are treating poorly. People often deny the rights of others because rights have power. To deny a right is to have power over someone and how they will live their lives, to force them to conform to our will. Slaves were compelled to work for a master's profit. Women were denied the right to divorce their husbands. We forcibly removed Native Americans from ancestral lands so those lands could be developed. Denying a right keeps someone submissive and dependent. When someone finds a voice and can effectively demand rights, laws change, and soon they leave subservience behind. People also deny rights to isolate categories of people. Recent immigrants who don't speak English, maybe homosexuals whose lifestyles seem threatening, people who have an unfamiliar religious belief. This helps a group build a narrative that defines who they are, who their relevant community is, and who they are not. This helps these communities believe that they, with their cultures, values, and beliefs, are superior to people who are different. This promotes cohesion and builds loyalty to people who are like us, and intensifies dislike of and hostility towards those who are maybe not our kind. Only a small stop away here from there to believing that people outside their community do not really deserve the same rights as those superior people within. Sorry, I keep doing that. Disputes arise because we often think equal must mean identical or the same, thus making equality threatening to the American value system, which prizes freedom to be different and unique. We rely on our government to guarantee fair treatment and equal opportunity. This is a procedural guarantee that we've talked about, rather than to manipulate fair and equal outcomes. This is substantive guarantees. We want our government to treat everybody the same, and we want people to be free to be different, but we don't want the government to treat people differently in order to make them equal at the end. When laws are changed, this is a procedural solution, but substantive action may still be necessary to ensure equal treatment in the future. We have some rights that have been denied on the basis of race. We cannot escape the history of race relations here. The narratives of white supremacy and black inferiority were told to numb sensibilities of European Americans. This has been almost as dangerous as slavery itself and has lived on in the American psyche and in politics much longer than the practice they justified. Racism is the institutionalized power inequalities in society based on the perception of racial differences. This is not a Southern problem. This is not a black problem. It is an American problem, and one that we have not yet eradicated from the national culture. Would it be a good thing or a bad thing if we treated people all exactly the same? What would that look like? At the time before the Civil War, there were almost 4 million slaves in the South and nearly 500,000 free blacks in the rest of the country. But even if slavery was illegal, blacks didn't enjoy the full right of citizenship. Dred Scott in 1857 was the Supreme Court case that ruled that blacks can't be citizens because the founders hadn't considered them citizens when the Constitution was written. Abolitionists, or a coalition of free blacks and northern whites working to end slavery prior to the Civil War, they tried strategies here. They put pressure on the Republican Party to take a stand on political equality. And they persuaded 3 legislatures, Iowa, Wisconsin, and New York, to hold a statewide vote on black suffrage between 1857 and 1860. They lost all 3 by large margins. Even in the North, public opinion didn't favor blacks at the time. Obviously, after the Civil War, it was not fought simply over the morality of evil slavery. Slavery was also an economic and political issue as well as an ethical one. The Emancipation Proclamation was Lincoln not simply taking a moral stand. He was trying to use economic pressure to keep the country intact. This didn't free all slaves, only those in states that rebelled against the Union. So the 13th Amendment was eventually passed, which banned slavery. It was passed by Congress in 1865, and it was a huge blow to Southern white power. The South retaliated to ensure their dominance with things like Black Codes, which was a series of laws in the post-Civil War South designed to restrict the rights of former slaves before the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments. This essentially sought to keep blacks in subservient economic and political position by legally restricting most of their freedoms, voting, property owning, education, things like that they'd gained by becoming a citizen. In Reconstruction, obviously the period following the Civil War during which the federal government took action to rebuild the South, the 14th Amendment was passed in order to make Black codes unconstitutional, guaranteed that all people naturalized or born in the United States had the right of citizenship and no state can take that away. The 15th Amendment in 1879 effectively extended the right to vote to all adult males, and Southern life began to change. Blacks voted, were elected to some local offices, cemented Republican dominance with their support, but Southern whites responded with violence. KKK terrorized blacks, lynching, arson, assaults, beatings. It made it scary to associate with these Republicans. Southerners set about the business of stripping blacks of their newfound political power. So the disenfranchising blacks really became easy to accomplish. The 15th Amendment said the right to vote couldn't be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So the Democrats who controlled the South set out to deny it in other ways. Things like a poll tax, which was a tax levied as a qualification for voting. This took away the right to vote for most blacks who were too poor to pay to vote. Literacy tests requiring reading or comprehension skills as a qualification to vote. Most blacks were denied education so they couldn't read. Jim Crow laws, Southern laws that were denied to circumvent the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and deny blacks rights black rights on bases other than race. Jim Crow was a pejorative expression meaning Negro. It proved to be very effective, and by 1910, registration of black voters had dropped dramatically, and the registration of poor, illiterate whites had also fallen. Southern Democrats were back in charge, and they eliminated the possibility of competition. Segregation is the practice and policy of separating races. There were separate facilities for blacks and for whites, for leisure, for business, travel, education. Facilities for whites were newer and cleaner and more comfortable. Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case that established the constitutionality of the principle of separate but equal. At the time, folks embraced the separate but forgot the equal part of the ruling, thinking the Supreme Court had approved segregated facilities. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1910 to promote civil rights for African Americans. Thurgood Marshall was a young lawyer for them who decided to launch an attack in education. The poor quality of black education in the South was reinforced beliefs about black inferiority. Instead of immediately targeting elementary schools when he went about this would have terrified whites. So he started with law schools, which would kind of fly under the radar of most. There were no black law schools, and the Supreme Court knew well these injustices. So this was a masterful strategy. Justices had the shared experience of law school, and it was impossible for them to refute arguments that separate education was unequal. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. The Supreme Court, so obviously Brown, we call this Brown versus Board. It was a Supreme Court case that rejected the idea that separate could be equal in education. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of Linda Brown and held that separate by itself could never be equal because it was the separation itself that made black children feel unequal. Segregation in education was inherently unconstitutional. This didn't bring instant relief to the Southern school system, though. We know all about schools like in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, where the governor posted the National Guard at a local high school to prevent the attendance of 9 black children. This was a catalyst for civil rights movement that would change our whole country, though. Obviously, Rosa Parks, 1955. She refused to yield her seat to a white passenger, and so she was arrested and sent to jail. There was a boycott, the refusal to buy certain goods or services as the way to protest the policy or force political reform. Local groups in the black community boycotted the Montgomery bus system, and they made up most of the bus riders. The boycott continued for over a year before the Supreme Court affirmed a lower court that the law was unconstitutional, that separate bus accommodations were not equal. There's 2 kinds of discrimination. De jure discrimination, which is discrimination by law, discrimination that arises from or is supported by the law. This is what most blacks in the South faced, especially in rural areas where blacks and whites worked and lived side by side. They had to use separate facilities because the law said so. And then you have de facto discrimination. This is discrimination that's the result not of law, but rather of tradition and habit. Discrimination in fact, de facto discrimination. This is a lot more difficult to eliminate. Segregation in the North was this way because blacks and whites didn't live and work in the same places. It wasn't laws that kept them apart, but past discrimination, tradition, custom, economic status, and residential patterns. It was hard to remedy because there are no laws here to change. Martin Luther King Jr. became known for his nonviolent approach to the political protest. This is important not just for the practices it challenged directly, but for the pressure it brought to bear on elected officials. JFK didn't want to alienate Southern Democrats, but the political pressure of black interest groups forced him to take a more visible stand. He sent federal mediators to Birmingham to negotiate an end to segregation, and then he sent Congress a massive package of civil rights legislation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 disallowed discriminatory tests like literacy tests and provided for federal examiners to register voters throughout most of the South. The 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes in federal elections. Fighting de facto discrimination was a little more difficult. It didn't translate to substantial economic gains. Blacks really remained at the bottom of the economical hierarchy. There were black Muslims led by Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, etc. They all demanded black power and radical change, but they rejected the Martin Luther King peaceful attempt to bring about gradual change. Something called busing was attempted to achieve racial balance by transporting schools to students across neighborhood boundaries. Black students would be bused to schools in white neighborhoods and vice versa. The Supreme Court endorsed this, but ruled 3 years later that busing plans couldn't merge districts and that they couldn't do that unless they could prove that lines had been drawn in a racially discriminating manner. So some early efforts at affirmative action. As the North showed, the absence of legal discrimination doesn't necessarily mean equality. Affirmative action is the policy of creating opportunities for members of certain groups as substantive remedies for past discrimination. So, for example, if a firm has no black employees, it wasn't enough to have a policy against hiring them. The firm had to actively recruit and hire blacks. This counted in universities as well. The Supreme Court affirmed this decision, though it took issue occasionally with specific implementations. The end result of affirmative action does seem attractive, but the means to get there by treating people differently may seem inherently unfair in the American value system. Do we agree with this? Do we disagree with this? There have been political gains and losses. Obviously, Obama in 2008 was elected and served 2 terms as president. He had higher voter turnout and increased turnout with African Americans. His election promised to usher in a much more relaxed attitude toward race, but he faced unprecedented obstruction from Congress and many Americans who maybe even said he wasn't born in the United States and wasn't ever qualified to be president. One commentator called Trump's election a white lash to Obama's presidency. Affirmative action, though, can't really be about racism and bigotry, but 2 images about what America ought to be. One side who has a vision of America whose discriminatory past is the past and whose job today is to treat all citizens the same. Providing a lower set of standards is not fair to anybody. People tend to perform at the level of competition, and when the bar is raised, we tend to rise to that occasion. This is what black students will do in a society that has equal standards for all. Ward Connerly said that. He's an African-American businessman. The other side of affirmative action argues that these programs have made a real difference in equalizing chances in society, and though they're meant to be temporary, their work is not yet done. Well, what about other groups that have faced discrimination? Native Americans. The relationship between the original inhabitants of this continent and the colonists and the lingering effects of this continues to color things today. The Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, gives Congress the power to regulate trade with foreign nations among the several states and with the Indian tribes. They were perceived as neither foreign countries nor states, and in 1831, the Supreme Court said that Native Americans were domestic dependent nations. Congress continued to deny many of the rights promised in their treaties in order to exploit their natural resources as so abundant in the western lands they've been forced onto, or if they've been forced to sell rights in order to survive. They're very different in the political world than African Americans. Indians are tribes as well as citizens of tribes as well as citizens of the United States, with rights coming from both. They have formed groups to draw the attention to the plight of Native Americans. Since the 1980s, they've parlayed their status as semi-sovereign nations into a foundation for economic prosperity. For instance, if a state maybe allows any gambling, they may allow the Indian reservations in that state may allow all sorts of gambling subject to regulation only from the Department of the Interior and so lots have giant casinos and a lot of money pouring into their coffers from that. Another diverse group with a history of discrimination that faces particular challenges of their own are Hispanic Americans. They have a language barrier. They're the largest minority group in the United States. There are things like the English-only movements, efforts to make English the official language of the United States. This has appeared on ballots and official documents, and it's clearly about more than language. It's about national and cultural identity, the struggle to lay claim to the voice of America. It's harder, when you look at Asian Americans, they also face discrimination. It's harder to, they are more identifiable by their appearance, and so it's harder for Asian Americans to assimilate into a European American population. 1882 and 1925 exclusionary laws had problems for them, but obviously anti-Asian sentiment was at its highest. During World War II, the Japanese Americans were rounded up and forced to abandon or sell property and put into detention camps. The unusual feature of Asian Americans is their overall academic success and economic prosperity. They were forced out of wage labor in the West in the 1880s by resentful white workers and had to become entrepreneurial. Many owned their own businesses and restaurants. They maybe have a cultural emphasis on hard work and high achievement that lent well to success in American education and a culture of equality of opportunity. And many were highly skilled in their own countries and passed along these values when they came to America. This stands in an odd relationship to affirmative action because they are admitted at high levels to elite schools. Sometimes these policies are harmful because they're so well qualified that they'd be admitted even if race were not taken into account. So policies that pit minority groups against each other in this way don't necessarily promote solidarity and community among them. Voter turnout should be quite high in Asian American groups, but they're not because they should be quite high because turnout usually corresponds with education and income. But Asian American turnout is actually typically the lowest in the nation. They tend to register as independents, but they simply may not vote because no one asks them to. All right, what about gender? Women's struggle for equal rights has been perhaps the most peculiar because women were not outside the system in the same way that racial and ethnic groups have been. But women's work was in the home. White women were to be good and pure, and they were too chaste to deal with a sordid world outside. Women weren't slaves, but not much different. When a woman married, she merged her legal identity with her husband's. She could no longer be party to a contract, bring a lawsuit, own or inherit property, earn wages for any service, gain custody of her children in a divorce. They couldn't initiate a divorce from an abusive husband. If her husband was not a U.S. citizen, she lost her citizenship. Neither married nor unmarried women could vote. Unmarried women didn't have a lot of opportunities. Most worked in domestic service and later in the textile industry. Most married women didn't work outside the home at all. Women targeted states in searching for rights that were sympathetic to them, and they gradually gained enough political clout to demand that their demands were listened to at a national level. 1919, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment granted women the right to vote, was introduced by Congress by President Wilson and Woodrow Wilson and passed in both houses. In August of 1920, it was ratified, and we just recently celebrated that. If women gained equal rights, an entire way of life would be over. So that was part of what the struggle here was. Most women lacked the money, the political contacts, and the experience to get involved in politics, and politically active women were ostracized and accused of maybe being unfeminine, making political involvement too costly to many. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, but it didn't ensure constitutional protection against discrimination. The Equal Rights Amendment was a constitutional amendment passed by Congress, but was never ratified because it would have banned discrimination on the basis of power. Do you think it's possible to have too much equality? Just something to think about. Gender discrimination today, there are some laws that do treat men and women differently that have been upheld by the Supreme Court. For example, a statutory rape law, laws requiring that only males be drafted. The Paycheck Fairness Act prohibits discrimination and retaliation against workers who bring discrimination claims. It remains controversial. Republicans claim that women make less money for reasons other than discrimination, like maybe they leave the labor market to have children and the market forces should prevail without legislation. Others say there's an enduring difference in hiring and salary patterns of women that has nothing to do with that. and the glass ceiling that we so often talk about. Sexual harassment, the unwelcome speech, sexual speech or behavior that creates a hostile work environment, often makes an unpleasant and offensive workplace. The Me Too movement. There are a high rise of number of cases of discrimination reported by pregnant women. Roughly half say their bosses reacted negatively to their pregnancies. That happened to me when I was working in DC. I have 3 children now, and it was a rough go for a while there. We have a long way to go. The Supreme Court ruled in 2015 that if a business was not intentionally discriminating against a pregnant woman, it could not impose significant burdens on her in violation of the Pregnancy Discrimination Act without sufficient justification. Women are entering politics, obviously. In 2016, we had the first woman presidential candidate, and now we have our very first female vice president. Their rights, obviously, they're denied on other bases. Sexual orientation. Until 2011, gays couldn't serve openly in the military. Age. Younger people can't vote, but older people defend their interests very effectively. Voter participation rises with age, and older Americans are typically well organized politically. Disability. People with mental and physical disabilities have organized politically to fight for their civil rights. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, modeled on the civil rights legislation that empowers racial and gender groups, this protects the rights of the disabled and guarantees protection from biased employment. Should citizens be treated the same as non-citizens? The Constitution gives them most of the same rights except for the right to vote. The pluralist model of democracy best describes the actions that citizens have taken to gain the government's protection of their civil rights. This emphasizes the ways that citizens can increase their individual power by organizing into groups. All right, you guys, I'm not going to give you a participation question today. Your participation is to go study for your exam. That will be posted on Monday, and you will have a week to take it. You only have a certain amount of time before it expires, and those directions will be posted. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks.